So that was two different one-wire patches on the Kastle Drum. On the one hand, sort of a simple kick and snare pattern, and then on the other, some noise. There's a lot of different sounds that you can get out of this device. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so before I start going into details about the different settings and patch points and stuff like that, I feel like there's an important sort of fundamental patch to show up front, and that is just to go from the pattern patch point to the drum mod patch point. And I'm going to turn the drum mod all the way up, and you'll start to hear the different drum sounds that the Kastle Drum can make. So we got a little glitchy pattern, glitchy beat going, and then I'm able to make changes to that. I think that patch also explains some of the design choices and the way some of the functionality fits together that we'll see throughout this video. Alright, so let's take a look at the Kastle Drum's layout and compare it side by side with the original Kastle. And if you have got a Kastle, this will make more sense, but I think it's also a useful comparison just in general, that you've got two sound outputs over here, the oscillator out and the secondary oscillator on the old Kastle. And so on the Kastle Drum, you've got drums out and you've got noises out. So two sound sources. And then very similar layout of the pattern generating sort of signal type of patch points. Over here we've got the square LFO. Over here we've got clock. This is the triangle LFO, which is just LFO over here. And then this stepped LFO is called pattern over here. Bit in becomes feed. LFO reset over here becomes clock in over here. And very similar in terms of those knobs also, so something to control the main pitch. This is the drum knob. I'll get to that in just a second. But here's the oscillator timbre knob, which is also a pitch over here for what gets sort of mixed in depending on the synthesis mode. And same thing goes for the pitch knob on the drum. This is the LFO rate. This is the tempo, very similar behavior. Rate mod over here, tempo mod over here, and the corresponding patch point. Timbre mod over here, and pitch mod over here with the patch points. And then the pitch mod and the drum mod. So a lot of that is very similar, and then of course a lot of the sort of control or functionality details are similar. So I/O left and right is the same, plus and minus. In the middle here you've got a wave shape on the old Kastle that sort of controls how the two oscillators are mixed together. That is a little bit true over here on the Kastle Drum, but this is mainly a decay knob now, so control over the sound envelope. But where we really see the functionality difference between the original Kastle and the Kastle Drum is at the mode socket over here. This controls whether you're doing something like performance or FM or noise, and over here this has just become the trig in. So we're going to see in just a sec that triggers the drum sounds. And so what's really happened to get rid of the mode is that the mode has actually been sort of encapsulated in the drum control, in the drum knob. And so that the different drum types that are based on different synthesis types, those are going to be selected by the drum knob, also with the drum modulation. And there are 8 different types. So you don't really need a mode selector for the drum. You really need something that can trigger the drums and then something that lets you make a choice of what's actually being played. And so if you're already a Kastle user, I think you can see that there's a lot of parallels between the two devices, but there are enough changes to where there is sort of a learning curve on the Kastle Drum. And so a big part of the Kastle Drum is just making changes to this drum parameter, and you can do that directly on the knob. So you'll find yourself sort of hearing some sounds coming from nowhere sometimes with it. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about sound here for a second. That right now I'm tapping out of the main output, and I like it. It's certainly not as hot as my original Kastle's output, so it's easier to deal with for recording and listening with headphones. But I am going to move over here to the I/O and tap off of that, and currently we don't have anything there. And what I'm going to do is, and I'll try to have this set up consistently, is from the drums output, so that's a sound output, I'm going to go into my left channel there, and now when I do this, you're going to only hear that on the left channel of headphones. And then I'm going to go from the right channel, right on red, and go into the noises. All right, and so this is going to give us something that we wouldn't normally hear out of the main output that sounds like this. If I go over to the main, you don't hear anything there. Still hear the drum. I feel like that I'm going to just leave it set up like this in many cases, because that way it will give you folks following along a way to hear the different sounds, either from the drum side or from the noise side. And I kind of like it also because I'm able to sort of choose after recording which one that I want to sort of enhance, be it drums or noises. And so since I'm doing these independently, you should actually, even on something like a smartphone, be able to hear the difference. But as soon as we start doing some more complicated stuff, headphones will really help to kind of give the idea of what I'm talking about, where that you have these choices over the two different types of output. And just for a little bit of terminology, this sort of thing where I'm turning the knob, I've started to call that sparking, because as you'll see in some of the noise stuff, it's sort of like you are dealing with an engine and you got to kind of spark it a little to get it going. So that's sparking. And then there's another thing that I'll call surfing, which is where you get right on the edge of one of these instability points of the drum control, and you can get sound out of the device with no modulation. Let me see if I can find one here. It's better with decay all the way up. Okay, so I'm not really patching anything here. It's just that I'm right on sort of an instability point of this drum parameter. And so now to hear some of this better, I'm going to take a signal from the clock patch point. So that's something that think of it as a low or zero voltage and a high voltage that are sort of a square wave alternating back and forth. And I'm going to send that over to the trig in. And so the leading edge and the trailing edge are going to cause that to trigger, and it's going to sound like this. And I feel like a little more decay helps us hear what's actually going on. And so then something to listen closely to here is that when I change the drum knob, it's not just changing the type of synthesis. There's also some pitch increase there too. So you can sort of think of it as a range. And then the pitch is, I think, more like a pitch that's actually sort of modulated in depending on the synthesis mode. Now, an important thing to point out is that low decay values are actually up at the top, and that you can get longer decay values in both directions. And this is the place where you can hear that there's a pitch change and an envelope change over here when you go counterclockwise, and then just the envelope change over here when you go clockwise. So decay is a great way to get a lot of different sounds and sound variety on the Kastle Drum. So that's more of a classic kick drum type sound. And if you listen to the two different channels that I've got going, you'll hear a click on the noise side, and I feel like that mixing the two, and it's not really there in the, when you use the out, you can sort of do the thickening trick where you connect the noises and the drums together by a patch, but I feel like having both of the signals is pretty nice because you can sort of enhance that clickiness to make a more of a clicky kick drum if you want. Now let's take another look at the pattern to drum mod patch. We're sending signals into these patch points, and then these knobs just determine sort of how much of those signals get through to whatever the parameter in question is. If you have these set to 0, then any signal you send in doesn't really do anything, but you don't necessarily always want to have things maxed. You can, for instance, like that kick snare pattern that I did at the very beginning of the video, that was just sort of choosing between two different drum sounds, and so you can do less and get different patterns. And let me just find something that sounds a little bit different. And so let's talk about this pattern generator for just a second. If that were all it could do, I'd probably get tired of it, but just by some simple changes in the feed patch point, so I'm going to put a negative into that. This is going to make it a shorter pattern. And then if I put a positive into the feed, you can turn it into a random pattern. And an important thing to understand about feed is that once you sort of randomize the pattern generator, you can pull feed out and it will leave you a different pattern. And this is just sort of the nature of the Wrangler circuit that's under the hood here. And so I can just turn this thing off, turn it back on, and it'll go back to that default pattern. Now, before I start talking about making noise with the Kastle Drum, I just want to do one slightly more complicated beat making sort of patch. And so to start with, I'm just going to do as we did before. I'm going to send the clock signal over to the trig in. So that's going to be what's sort of making our drums happen. And then I'm also going to send that clock signal to the tempo modulation. And that's going to be something that we really need to fine tune along with the tempo in just a second. And then sort of the main difference is that I'm going to send from the pattern not to any of the drums or that sort of thing, but to the decay, and we'll get some variation in the sound from the decay itself. And then as far as the settings go, I'm going to leave the drum modulation down, pitch modulation down. I'll start the tempo modulation somewhere like 10 o'clock, and then the decay I'm going to put sort of the same, and then have the drum type pointed over here, and a little bit of pitching up, and tempo. And again, this is the sort of thing that you kind of have to fine-tune by ear, but this is where we're at right now. And to reiterate, I'm tapping the sound off of the drum and the noise outputs, and so you're going to get different sounds in your left and right channel. So let's turn it on. I think lower, faster. So I like that, it's got a swing to it from using the tempo mod. You can vary that a little bit. Kind of like it slower. Gives some of those decays time to happen. And I just want to point out that a really, I'd say, brilliant design feature of the Kastle Drum is to have that sort of choppy low decay right at the middle of this parameter, the decay parameter, because then that lets you use something like the pattern generator that only does positive voltages. Lets you push it from one type of long decay through short decays to the other type of long decay, and so you can get a lot of different variety. And I really like what I'm hearing in the noise side of this also. So there's something a little bit more hat-like. Now, noise on the Kastle Drum, how do you go about it? One thing to think of is that the low frequency oscillator, well, it doesn't have to stay low. It can actually go pretty high up into audio rate. So I'm going to do a thing where that I take the clock signal, let me turn it on, and I'm going to send that just into one of our audio outputs. Now, be careful doing this if you're tapping the audio outputs directly, like I'm doing. I use a inline volume control and can turn that quite a bit down. So what happens when I crank this up? You can hear it. So that's pretty high. That's just the actual clock at high speed. You can do it with the triangle LFO. It's more mellow, and you can certainly do it with the pattern as well. A little bit more unstable. So those sounds don't really have anything to do with the sound generation or synthesis of the Kastle Drum, just the signals turned up very fast. And as I was saying, just be careful about the volume of those if you're doing it coming out of the output like I'm doing. But to me, the most interesting sorts of noise on here that are easy to make come from using the audio outputs as actual control signals. So think about it, instead of using a simple square wave or triangle wave or pattern to modulate something, you use the actual audio itself. The first of these is not quite as good. It's to take the noise sound and send that into the pitch modulation, and turn the pitch modulation all the way up, and then I'm going to turn it on, and we got a little something there. Okay, so that's pretty nice. What's going on there? It's making a noise sound, and then that noise sound is making more noise sound. And of course, it's also triggering the drums in some way. I don't really understand quite some of the interconnectivity between the drum side of things and the noise side of things. It may depend on what mode you're in over here, but you don't really need to. You just you don't really need to understand it. You just sort of play around with it and see if you can find some stuff. All right, and a lot of this works best when the decay is up quite high to give sort of a more continuous sound. And that works okay, but the thing that I did at the very beginning of the video, and I think it's a more reliable noise source, is to go from the drum sound output, so again taking audio, and send that into the drum modulation patch point, turn this modulation all the way up. I'm going to have the decay up, kind of a lowish pitch, and then we spark it. And once you've got it going, you can do different things to change it. This has got nothing to do with the LFO or tempo setting. All about decay and pitch and which of the drum synthesis methods you're using. Crashed it. So there's a lot with just that one concept of feeding an audio signal back into the thing that makes that audio signal in the first place. Now, I'm going to make a little bit more of an elaborate patch here. I'm going to, first of all, switch over to just the regular main output. So I'm going to get rid of these guys and then switch there. Might have to adjust the volume. Clean slate here, and what I want to do, I don't know, it's kind of a feedback type thing, but not a simple one, where I'm going to take the clock signal and send that to the pitch modulation. And I'm going to have the pitch modulation turned up. And so what that will do is trigger the noise sounds. And this is going to be requiring us to have the LFO up some too. I'm going to have it up quite high. And then after that, I'm going to take the sound that comes out of the noises. So those are some really complex audio signals, and I'm going to send those into the drum mod patch point and have that all the way up to start with. And so it's this chain of clock making noises, noises making the drum type change. And we'll see what we can get. So that's pretty much one of the best explosion sounds you'll get. If I use my volume control, it's pretty convincing. Rocket or explosion. I think that'd be nice with some reverb or delay. But you can do a lot more with this. Probably best with the LFO up quite high. So I feel like that is a lot of interesting and complex noise sounds that you can get out of the Kastle Drum. I'm going to be thinking about sampling it to use for percussion sounds or for ambient sounds, maybe looping some of it to make synth sounds. And so overall, I feel like the Kastle Drum is a really great sound source. So I'm going to talk in the outro for a second, but then after that, I'm going to show something that it's not quite noise, I guess, but it has got a sort of randomness to it that I feel like fits in with some of the stuff that I've been showing. So I really like the kind of Undertale 8-bit glitchy vibe of the Kastle Drum, and not just in terms of the sounds, but also sort of the way that you go about patching it and playing it. And it's quite different from the Kastle synth, where the kind of the default state for this thing is that it will just make a sound and you go about how to modify that. For the drum, it's more how are you going to get the patterns and the sequences and rhythms that you want. So I'll be talking about that a lot more in the next video, where I show hooking these two up and hooking other devices to the Kastle Drum. But I want to close this video out by referencing something that I did about 6 months ago with the original Kastle, which was this Kastle DNA series that I did. And a lot of that involved random patching and doing a genetic algorithm type thing. And I just decided that I would try out the same code. It was not hard to modify to do random patches on the Kastle Drum. And again, to support what I was just saying about the difference between these two, I find that it's a lot more easy to get some sort of sound out of a random patch on the synth than it is on the drum. And so I was not very lucky coming up with a lot of cool patches that either were random or evolved for the Kastle Drum. But one thing that I did find, and I did maybe 50 random patches, and this is something that I've noticed before, which is that even if the patch itself isn't that good, there's something that sort of happens in it and you can extract a piece of it and get something out of it. And so this is something that I really like about this type of video, where I try something weird off camera and sort of can winnow it down and come up with like one thing to share. And I'm going to just show that to close this video out. What it is that I am going to use a single wire from the tempo modulation patch point to the drum modulation patch point. Makes no sense on the face of it, because those are places that you would normally send signals to, and I'm just connecting them. But I think there's some sort of crosstalk or bleed through on the tempo circuit, so that's the tempo knob and the tempo modulation. And so the voltage fluctuations coming out of the tempo modulation are enough to trigger the drum sounds, and it does it in some sort of way that it's not a very uniform thing, and I feel like I hadn't really heard it coming from any other way on the device, so might end up being something that's kind of useful at some point. So take a look at that. I hope everybody's doing well, and thanks a lot for watching. Alright, so again, this is something that only makes sense probably sort of under the hood in terms of crosstalk or something like that. I've got the tempo mod routed to the drum mod only, and I'm going to turn it on, and then eventually I'm going to add in some reverb. So give it a listen. And that, if you hear all those beats, that's a sort of kind of tinkly, random pattern that I don't know any other way to get on here, so that's why I'm really wanting to share it. And it can get quite noisy. I'm going to add reverb when it's more open like that. Now without reverb. So this is some of my favorite of it. So it can go more complicated, faster, louder, noisier, but this is sort of fragile. So here I was able to add a much slower LFO to give that pitch variation. Still keep the fast beats coming from this whatever it is. Alright, thanks for listening.